Hey, Mish, James here. Just let you know everyone is prepped and ready to go whenever you want. I believe Luke and Paul will be first up 15 minutes, so you can introduce them in a minute or two whenever you're ready.
Okay, cool. Is everybody else, is the panel ready as well? Everybody ready to go?
Yep.
Excellent. So we've got a very important and topical subject today in terms of dental practice. And for that, we have Dental Elite with Luke Moore and Paul Wilkinson talking about buying and selling practices. And we'll be on the panel with Mike Bryan from Humphrey & Co. and Louise from Morrison Solicitors as well. So it should be really good. And we've also got a dentist on the panel as well. One little thing is that if you can go to National Dental Seminars, if you haven't got your core CPD, day sorted, remember to sign up to that. And before cracking on, I just want to thank the sponsors as usual, in Dental Elite, Invisalign, Rights, Gentle Dental Care and Denplan, alongside Kerr and Humphrey & Co, who are supporting us. Okay, Luke, without further ado, I'll hand over to you to take over and so on. And any questions, please do add into the chat box and so on as well. All right, Luke, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Mish. So, as Mish introduced, obviously, as you can see, I'm Paul Wilkinson, and I'm with Luke Moore, co-founders of Dental Elite. The format, which you probably actually heard anyway prior to this starting, Luke and I are probably going to just sort of 10-15 minutes on what the market's been doing over the last 6 to 12 months, give you a bit of idea of goodwill values, certain trends that we're seeing, and then we'll bring in the other guys. Hopefully they can give you a bit of advice and tips on other areas in the market relating to sales and acquisitions. So Luke, obviously with our opening bit about the market and then over the last 12 years. So from obviously there's various things that we can talk on in terms of values and why. But I suppose to open up, are you finding that it's evident at the moment that location is probably playing a crucial role in values?
To an extent, yes, and to an extent, no. I think where you've got, so you've always got areas that are more popular than others. So if you're talking about the obvious suspects, sort of London and the home counties, you're talking about probably Birmingham, Leicester, that kind of M1 corridor going up as far as Yorkshire and then into Manchester. And it's certainly true that practices in those areas do sell a lot quicker and often sell for a higher value. So you'd argue that there is a location premium associated with those areas, whereas contrastingly, if you go across into, for argument's sake, sort of like the east to sort of Norfolk, Suffolk, or down into the southwest peninsula, then things become a little bit more, a little bit less competitive. But I think that's only really true where you've got the owner-operator market. And by that, what I mean is people who are buying a practice with a view to work in it personally. So in that respect, it kind of mirrors the recruitment market. So where you struggle to recruit dentists is often where you find for the smaller practices, there's a slightly lower value attributed to them because there's just not the volume of buyers in those kind of areas that there are in others. With that said, though, we do sell a lot of practices in those areas very successfully. Contrastingly, though, where you've got practices which are bigger and fully private, or where you've got bigger NHS practices where you don't have the recruitment challenges, it doesn't really matter where in the UK the practice is, because there's so much interest at the moment in kind of the corporate model and the corporate consolidation exercise, then actually it's probably fair to say that a multiple on a practice in Surrey, which is where I'm sitting tonight, is fair for a bigger practice, is probably fairly similar to a practice in Exeter, which has a big, is very successful privately as well. Because if you're looking at selling that practice to, for argument's sake, one of the groups that use Portman by way of example, Portman will pay the same multiple practice in Exeter as they will in Surrey. It doesn't really matter. The geography doesn't really matter to them. And because there's a volume, a large volume of private consolidators now, there's probably, I don't know if you'd agree with me, probably 9 to 11, I'd say, big private consolidators out there. Some more active than others, but there's certainly 6 or 7 that appear on every transaction, regardless of where it is in the UK. And to them, geography isn't a big challenge.
I mean, do you think though that if you look at the recruitment issue at the moment with dentists in the UK, is if you compare, I mean, we've been in the market for a while, for a long time, over a decade, you even longer.
I had hair when I started back in the day.
I'm going grey and you've got no hair, so it's a sure sign. But do you think recruitment has a play in that? Because obviously back in the day, location was less important, whereas we're finding now that actually there are some concerns about recruitment, particularly for the group acquirers. Because as you said, in some locations, the competition for the smaller market, the sort of independent first-time buyer market, is a struggle where you don't have the volume of buyers, so you struggle to stimulate competition and price. Yet on the other hand, you then have these areas equally that struggle with a population of dentists, so that when it comes to acquiring, say on the Norfolk coast or the Welsh coast, it actually does become a challenge for some acquirers.
Yeah, I think it's that age-old battle, is that you can probably buy a practice slightly cheaper on, as you mentioned, the Welsh coast there, but then it comes with greater risk, and that's where I suppose standard economics comes in, where if you're paying weight of supply and demand, and if you're accepting higher risk, you expect a higher return, which then in turn means you pay less for it at the outset. And I think most of the groups now tend to focus on areas where they don't see big recruitment challenges long term, because they recognise actually, if you've, for argument's sake, I know obviously Wales has got rid of UDAs, but if you use UDAs by way of example, because most people listening to us will use that as a metric, is that if you've suddenly got 7,000 UDAs that can't be delivered in your practice, that's 7,000 UDAs gross contribution, and that probably is most of your EBITDA. So it's not worth the risk. It's not like you can, if you miss by 100 UDAs, that's something different, quite different to losing a full-time dentist.
Yeah. And so when you look at I mean, again, looking at the more difficult areas as much as the popular areas here, is that actually, multiples and values have gone up quite significantly, probably in the last 24 months alone, and particularly in some of the larger, bigger, more competitive, cities and locations. And as a result of that, obviously prices are driven up and buyers are driven out at the same token. I mean, are you finding that actually we are because certainly for me, I think I'm starting to notice that we are starting to get buyers crop up in more locations, and that's probably because they can get more of a competitive sale compared to maybe if they're buying at 9-10 times as an individual in the M25, for instance.
Yeah. There are people who recognise the fact that if they're not particularly tied to an area. For instance, we've got a chap who I know is based or who originates from the Midlands, who's buying practices in Cumbria at the moment, because he takes the view that actually he can get significantly more for his money, and location isn't a big factor. But I think just to dovetail back on something you said, obviously it was only sort of 2 or 3 weeks ago we were talking about the NASDAQ survey, which was released, which kind of reported that there had been a fall in practice values, and we kind of looked at that in quite some sort of depth, because anecdotally it wasn't our own experience. Now, interestingly, what we actually found when we looked at the data is actually the stats that the NASDAQ guys were producing were actually pretty mirrored to kind of what we were selling practices at, in the sense of the fact that actually, I think, on average, say if they said it was say 120% turnover, we were selling at 130% of turnover, but we hadn't seen the fall. So I think what's interesting is the fact that obviously where you've got a survey that's released quarterly, you're always going to have fluctuations in terms of what the market is doing. Obviously we analyze the data on sort of a 12-monthly and 6-monthly basis, but I wouldn't say we've seen a fall, but equally I wouldn't say we've seen a massive jump either. I think we're sitting, if I was honest, fairly static. The only exception to that I would say is the big private practices, where we're seeing multiples are being pushed largely by the bigger consolidators, and as you say, the risk there is that what you've got is that if you're an independent buyer, a bank will only lend you, X amount of money based on the debt service cover of a given opportunity. So in order to meet the debt service cover requirements, you've got to put in more money, and that's where you start to see people, can on occasion be priced out because they don't want to put in that level of contribution to justify, the acquisition. So instead of, for argument's sake, putting down 20% on to buy £1 million practice and putting 200 grand down, suddenly to buy that practice they're having to put 300 or 400 grand down in order to get the right level of debt service cover, because that practice is selling at 8.5 times EBITDA, whereas 2.5-3 years ago that same practice might have sold at 6.5 to 7 times.
No, that's true. And to go back to the NASDAQ survey, as you said, is that actually we when we reviewed it, there wasn't that much difference in agreed completed price on the survey. But actually what was quite interesting is when we compared perhaps valuation price to agreed price, is that actually we found nowhere near the same disparity as what that survey found. In fact, I think our average was still 101% of valuation price to agreed price.
We had quite a long conversation about how you can manipulate statistics, which I won't bore people with today because it's not particularly relevant to what we're talking about. But arguably, we looked at it and said, well, actually, if we took all the practices we sold and and what we valued every single practice at and lumped it all together, we could use the headline that we sell practices for 101% of what we value them for, which misleads you into thinking that actually, every practice we sell for over asking price, which isn't correct. And then we kind of categorize them down, and I haven't got the stats in front of me, but I seem to remember it was something like, I think 83% of practices sold for within 2% of asking price either way, so either 98% to 102%. I think there was like another 7 or 8% which went over 102%, and then obviously the others were categorized into falling underneath that 98% margin. And some practices there will be a reason why. For instance, regrettably we've got a couple of sales at the moment where unfortunately the vendors passed away, so clearly what the value was when it was valued against what the value is, unfortunately, when the vendor passes away, is substantially different. But I think the point you're trying to get to is the fact that anyone can kind of move statistics around to say what they want them to say to an extent. But actually, we were quite comfortable that what we were valuing at was actually pretty much where practices were selling.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think you can look at these surveys and they are fairly subjective depending on the data that's being used. And they're all, to get our survey, NASDAQ, and various other agent surveys to match up would be an incredible task. So that in its own right. But is it fair to say that NASDAQ particularly probably considers a lot of valuations outside of where agents aren't used? So actually,
we can ask Mike that question in a minute. I actually think it's Alan Suggett that prepares the survey. So without throwing Mike under the bus, I think he does the NASDAQ benchmarking data. But I'm guessing he might have an opinion on that.
Yeah, we'll save that one for Mike then. So probably just to give a few brief maybe screenshots on what's happened sort of over the last 12 months is actually valuations have gone up, multiples have gone up. Our most recent Goodwill survey sort of said that actually, even though as a percentage of gross it didn't look like that, is that multiples actually had gone up, particularly where mixed practices and private practices, with NHS probably for the first time probably taking a bit of a dip. So how does that translate into what's going on?
What we realised, of course, was that actually what was happening was that practices were becoming marginally less profitable. So actually, as a percentage of turnover, told a different story to if you were looking at multiples of EBITDA. And part of that, of course, is because the NHS contract has remained, below inflation for a large period of time. Again, we could bore people with the whole Brexit debate and how that's impacted materials, lab fees and associate fees, which is also another kind of downward pressure. But I think in broad terms, where we've come across a little bit negative maybe for the first sort of 7 or 8 minutes, but in broad terms, the market is extremely active and you've got lots of people that are looking to come into the sector. And the reasons that is that as we've come out of COVID, of course, there's been lots of sectors who have been absolutely rinsed by what has happened. The hospitality sector is probably the most obvious one, but you've also got commercial property. You've got lots of other sectors with big supply chain issues at the moment. Whereas conversely, healthcare overall has actually been, if you like, the golden goose. If we look at our business, when dental practices reopened at the beginning of June last year, our business pretty much got back firing on pretty much all cylinders by the middle of July. And even though we've subsequently had 204 lockdowns since, or whatever we're now up to, various different guises, actually none of the lockdowns have really impeded dentistry at all. I know before Christmas we were talking about whether patients were leaving their houses because of the new Delta variant, or the Indian variant as it was called at the time. But actually in the main, there hasn't really been anything that's kind of really knocked dental since the beginning, since obviously the beginning of June when they came back. Because even though you had SOP and you had limited changing the SOP, which meant you had limited time, limited patients you could see in a given day. In a lot of scenarios, actually, a lot of practices, moved to more dynamic ways of seeing patients via Zoom or video consultations. A lot of practices, were able to sort of manage their diary accordingly to sort of use the SOP. And a lot of practices also moved towards doing more higher value treatments as people became increasingly, I think one of my clients called it the Zoom boom yesterday, where, they're doing things like this. So they're looking at their teeth, and people want Invisalign and they want teeth whitening. And so some of the more profitable treatments, are now becoming increasingly popular in practice. So private practice overall has actually seen in most instances a big rise in revenues. And in turn, obviously, a rise in EBITDA, because that tends to follow if you have a rise in revenue. And then in turn, you've got lots of private equity who don't want to invest in the riskier sectors at the moment. You've also got a lot of family money who may well have invested in commercial property that are now diverting that into the healthcare sector through family relations that they have. We had the banks come back fairly quickly. We've got a very active Lloyds at the moment. We've got a very active Barclays. We've got a very active Wesleyan, amongst others. And so what we're seeing is lots of money coming into the sectors from various different channels, and that is really pumping the market. And accordingly, that's why we're starting to see rises in the values paid in multiples of EBITDA, even though there maybe is a slight downward pressure on net profit in a number of instances.
Yeah, you're right. And I think if you look over the last decade, dentistry has very much become business focused. And even if you look at the split between independent sites to group sites that we've done over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, is you can see that whereas historically, and I'm not saying that we're not selling this, a similar volume, but, as a percentage from the last Goodwill survey, we were selling sort of circa 55% to individuals compared to 75%, probably only 18 months, 24 months ago. And what we have seen is a massive increase in, probably by I think it was 31% of deals that we had sold. We're now to those that own 10 sites plus, which has become a bigger and bigger trend as consolidation increases in the market. And as a result, as well as there is a ceiling to that based on what you're able to gain in capital. But
I think the shift in that is there is more people with more than 10 sites now. Is that probably when we did the Goodwill survey back in 2018, there's probably a very limited pool of people who are actively buying with more than 10 sites. What we've got now is you've had 2 or 3 years where there's been lots of consolidation against lots of different operators. So there's more people kind of in that marketplace. But I suppose the opposite end to that is that there's also then another sort of 69% we're still selling to individuals. If you listen to a lot of the headlines, you think the corporates are swallowing everything up, and actually often in the London and home counties areas in particular, more often it goes to people buying their sort of third, fourth or fifth practice than it goes to a group, because they can be more flexible on deal structure, often more flexible on price. And sometimes, as we were discussing at a meeting yesterday, is the fact that sometimes people would rather take £100,000 less on the headline price to get all of their money at completion. And there's a lot to be said for that, because you haven't got the tie-in, you haven't got the deferred consideration that you may or may not get depending on the practice performance in latter years. And you also then have the flexibility. So even though you may wish to stay on for sort of 4 or 5 years, is that if you don't like the boss, then potentially you could go earlier if you wish to.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I suppose to summarize our part then before we bring the guys in, I mean, the market over the last 12 to 18 months, I think at the start of the lockdown, I think everyone was a bit unsure, but I think it's safe to say that actually the market has gone from strength to strength. We've probably seen more buyers in the market who are keen to acquire. The consolidators are still very aggressive. In fact, there's still private equity invested in the market, as with the Royal Dental Company not long ago. Average price value is now over £1 million, which for the first time. So if anything, all the right noises are being made. I suppose it comes down to how far does it go, and do we hit a ceiling at some point, and what impact, which hopefully out of today we may get a bit of an idea from Baldip as well, who owns several sites, as to what from their point of view is how does their acquisition strategy change? How has running a practice changed since the pandemic, from terms of cost to PPE to recruitment costs? And there is the question, how far can multiples go? There comes to a point where, particularly for the consolidators, is there has to be a ceiling, unless there are very, very aggressive investors that are looking to buy top end.
Well, I suppose just a final note on that probably explains, going back to the argument about, is it always a group that buys my practice? And the reason why, groups tend to buy less or tend to be less competitive perceivably in London and home counties is that if you're a group, well, in the main, you've normally got one eye on your own exit. And if you're budgeting that exit, say to be at 14 times EBITDA, if you then start paying, 10 or 11 times EBITDA for a given practice, and then you've got to allow for a little bit of slippage in the EBITDA, and you've also got to allow for a head office arbitrage, quite quickly before you've got that practicing group, you're already in theory on paper paying 12.5 times for it, which doesn't leave a lot of fat, which means that's why often you see, even on practices that on the basis of revenues and profit, you would say this should sell to a group. It doesn't sell to a group because actually what the multiple is that's being paid doesn't make sense for a bigger group to acquire it.
Yeah. And one last point on that, and this is where that middle market is what's pushing it. It's not the top end, it's not the lower end, it's that middle market where actually they're less strict on having a buyer at some point at a certain level, where actually they can have a bit more flexibility in terms of how they buy, which is I suppose not great for the big guys, but great for the market overall and the seller, which ultimately is the end goal, isn't it? I suppose, to maximize what the seller can get for the practice. So
absolutely. So on that note, should we get everyone else on?
Yep. You can go on mute, guys, and
Mike's probably busy trying to research everything on the NASDAQ survey that I've just thrown him under the bus for.
I can't turn my video on, apparently. The host needs to do it.
Oh yeah, Mish, can you? Yeah.
I'm there. Yeah, got the Goodwill survey next to me.
Didn't misquote it, did we? Hopefully not. Still somebody tell us if we have.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks guys for coming on. I know Mish did a sort of a brief introduction, but I'll sort of do a quick introduction again just to remind who we've got. So we've got Louise Fegan, partner at Morrison's Law, specialising in corporate and company law, acting on a wide range of sort of mergers and acquisitions across the country. We've got Mike Bryan, partner at Humphrey & Co, chartered accountants, as well as assisting clients with their business finances. Mike will assist in the buying and selling of businesses as well, and advising his clients. Deals mainly in dental and medical and various other sectors from what I understand. And we're also joined by Baldip Chauhan as well. Baldip is a dentist that owns 5 practices, soon to be 9 sites, I believe, by the end of the year. And is currently still expanding his portfolio and very active in the market as a buyer. And obviously Luke, so maybe to kick starters then, I mean, obviously Luke and I don't own practices, so I'd be interested to hear from Baldip's point of view, because obviously we've known you for a while now. You've got several practices for us. In fact, I think going towards as the pandemic rose last year, is that you still sort of went on to acquire those practices. And I suppose from your point of view, and obviously now with 5 sites and 4 in the sort of SSTC, is how have you found the market, and in terms of your strategy, are you still thinking the same, or?
If I just rewind back a little bit, I'm not actually a dentist. My wife's a dentist. We own the practices together, but she doesn't get involved in the owning or running. So she leaves that to me, hence it's me sitting here today. Okay. And yeah, in terms of acquisitions, I think the last 2 practices I've purchased, and the next 3 out of the next 4 are private. I've seen a big trend in the private patients numbers coming in thick and far now. We was actually quite lucky because in 2 of our sites before the lockdown happened, we'd actually started putting another spare surgery into both sites. It was kind of in the planning, and then as the more COVID went on and the more we heard about it, we pushed the button on it. So soon as the lockdown ended, we kind of had a spare surgery within each practice for rotation, as opposed to stopping for the fallow time. Allowed us to take on a lot more new patients and expand our practice quite a lot over a number of different sites. So yeah, with acquisitions, I've not let COVID be a deterrent for me. I haven't found it to be something that should cause a problem or create a problem. I'm purchasing 4 more.
Yeah, so yeah, it's got to be a good thing. Yeah. I mean, so on that basis, have you found anything different being an owner, I suppose, from a cost-based point of view? And feel feel free to sort of jump in, Mike, as well, from your point of view on this, is, have you seen, profitability affected? Have you seen costs significantly rise, or is it a marginal increase to allow for some PPE? Where you
finding? We've definitely had a big rise in the PPE costs. We had two strategies here. Either we could charge a patient a PPE cost per appointment, or take it on the chin, which is what we decided to do, because we thought these patients have been loyal to us for all these years. And if we have to take it on the chin to keep the patients happy with the practice, then that's what we decided to do. So yes, there has definitely been increased costs with PPE, but hopefully it shouldn't be too much longer. It's just something I've got to ride out. Sorry.
I think with my clients, that you hit the two options about it. Absolutely. Do you charge them? Some are charging what they'd call a PPE fee. Essentially, it's just an automatic X amount of money for walking in the door. Some have just increased their sales prices slightly. So I don't know, maybe 1, 2, 5% on everything and every service they charge. I think private practices seem to have weathered that storm a bit better. NHS, obviously, it's not as feasible to charge a PPE cost. I think the public reaction to it, I mean, it does depend on location, but I've heard a reasonable amount of success for mainly private practices in doing that, so long they haven't gone too excessive. So it's about placing themselves correctly. In terms of profits, I mean, obviously in 2021, when I say 2021, the year to March 2021, so we're looking at the first lockdown. Most private practices seem to have bounced back, to be perfectly honest. They seem to have seen as many patients as they would have if they were open the full 12 months, be it via some additional opening hours, getting the air purifying systems in there, spending some capex. So I would expect to see a lot of air purifier systems. I know one of my clients has just put in an air purifying system that changes the air in the surgery in a matter of minutes. I think it's cost a lot of money, but their fallow time's now down to under 10 minutes, I think, to get the patient in and out. And generally pre-COVID times, it was 10 minutes anyway, because you've got to get the patient out and get the next patient in. So costs in that regard have gone up. NHS are now subsidising PPE themselves. So if you're mainly NHS, you should be claiming that from the NHS, I believe. I don't know how.
A lot of people are quite mixed about that, though, aren't they? Because, of course, what the government did is they bought a load of PPE, then they've served it off to dental practices, and now they're charging them, but they haven't actually got the option to say, no, we don't want your PPE. And a lot of them are saying the quality of the PPE they've been distributed, shall we say, is not what they would necessarily want to use.
Yeah, so I haven't had any positive or negative feedback on it yet, but I can imagine that because the whole abatement, it was 16.75%. They abated NHS practices when they were locked down, and again in what I'd call, it was Q4. There was another abatement for any underperformed UDAs compared to the actual proper target. So they're saying that PPE costs should equate to that kind of figure, and I don't think it quite marries up. NHS trying to swindle a few more pennies out of the dentist again there, probably.
Have we got any confirmation yet on what the pay rise is going to be? Because, of course, we've got the 3% headline, but often that doesn't translate into contract value, does it yet? So that's still being debated, isn't it?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, yeah.
To touching on costs a little bit more then, so obviously you mentioned then some of your clients are obviously investing in various machines and devices, and I suppose it's probably a question maybe to Luke, is that, obviously there's certain costs which matter in evaluation and which some that don't matter as much. And I suppose, in light of CapEx and CapEx expenditure, I think it's fair to say that those sort of things aren't going to affect valuation in the case you're invested in your existing sites.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of valuation, obviously the main things that matter is what you would call transferable costs. So and they break into two categories. So you've got your fixed overhead, which is your light and heat, your rent, all that kind of stuff. Now, in reality, there's not a great deal you can do about those kind of things. I mean, yeah, you can penny pinch and go and change suppliers on your light and heat and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, it's not going to be something that's fundamentally going to change your valuation. You've then got variable costs and staff. Now, staff all will, depending if you're a limited company or whether you're an asset sale, will all tube across, which is the transfer of undertaking of permanent employees, which means that if you pay your nurse £12 an hour, the new purchaser can't come in and suddenly decide to pay them £11 an hour. So if you go, as we see quite often, if you give all the staff a pay rise in the run up to sale or run up to completion, that has a significant effect on valuation, which can't be undone. So that's always something to think about. And of course, there is benchmarking data available that we produce, and of course, NASDAQ produce on what staff costs should look like. Now, the reality is you can't understaff your practice, because what a good value will do will recognise what your full-time equivalent headcount is, and whether that marries up to the level of dental input or clinical input going into the practice. Other variable costs, of course, costs that could change immediately on completion if the purchaser chose to do so. So, materials, lab fees, even associate fees, and hygienists if they're self-employed. But I think the reality is, going back to what we were talking about in the first 15 to 20 minutes, is what an independent buyer doesn't want to do, or indeed a group, is come in and rock the apple cart with all of the existing team. So the last thing you want to do is come in and start, chopping associate wages or hygiene, or changing the remuneration basis for a hygienist, or indeed changing the labs they use or the materials they use. So those kind of things are the stuff you need to do pre-completion if you really want it recognised in value.
Just to pick up on Luke's point, I think with the staff costs, if you're selling your practice, don't give your staff a pay rise. Feel free to give them a nice bonus to reward them for the years of service that they've had. The bonus is discretionary. You don't need to carry that on under tube. So that can drop off the new owner, but a pay rise, as Luke said, you're committing the new owner to carrying on that cost. And I think I'm seeing a lot of, and I don't know, Luke, if you would agree, but you mentioned the self-employment or employment status of the hygienist. I won't go into the legal side of it, but the flexibility that having self-employed hygienists has compared to having employed hygienists has actually made quite a bit of difference to a practice's bottom line. If you had them employed, okay, you could furlough them, but now when you're coming back, flexible furlough has been around, but certainly the self-employment of a hygienist has allowed more flexibility for practices to pick and choose when they have their hygienist in, and therefore increase their bottom line profits.
Yeah, I mean, we did some rough numbers on this, and of course it does depend on what you're charging out and what you're paying your hygienist, but give or take, it's about an 83% occupancy rate, which is about the pivot point. So if the occupancy of your hygienist is below 83%, we would suggest that they would probably often do better having them on a self-employed basis, because that means if you have got an empty chair for a period of time, or you have got patients failing to turn up, then actually often the hygienist, whilst they may be on a higher percentage remuneration, if you were to develop it, actually it's then the hygienist who's on risk as well as the practice. Whereas if you've got an employed hygienist and you've got, say, 2 or 3 empty slots a day, more often the practice is paying that, and the margin you should be making of your hygienist is quite quickly eroded by that empty chair time.
Yeah, I've got some practices, big practices, that employ their hygienists, and they actually lose money on the hygienist services. It's a service they've got to do, but it's not very profitable for them. Just Amir has just asked, where can you access the NASDAQ stats? I believe he's referring to. Speak to a NASDAQ accountant is the simple answer. Staffing should be around 20% of the turnover for a private practice. But yeah, all NASDAQ accountants will be able to benchmark performances of their clients to see where you stack up and see if you're in line or not in line for whatever reason.
Fine. Okay. So to bring in Louise a little bit on a few couple of legal questions, and maybe going back one step to the word COVID, but from your point of view. Particularly maybe legal questions, how things have changed since pre-pandemic, is what are you finding has changed in that sense from your point of view?
Well, it doesn't take much for solicitors really to produce reams more questions of due diligence, and of course COVID has given them that excuse, so you can expect another 3-4 pages on COVID type questions. I think the main things that to pick up on the due diligence with COVID is abatement is a big issue, because obviously with NHS contracts that abatement will follow through with the buyer who buys that. obviously the first set of abatements, which occurred last year from March to June, most of them should have come out now. They're paid in 4 instalments up until July, so that should not be an issue now. But there is obviously the ongoing issue of abatements for the first quarter. Have people achieved the 45%? Have they achieved the 60%? And I'm actually finding a lot of dentists actually, I don't think this was well told to the dentists how it's going to work. A lot of them think if they achieve 60%, that's the money, they get the 100% money, but they don't. The abatement is applied to the proportion that they didn't achieve. So obviously that has to be dealt with during due diligence. So we could do reconciliations on completion there. So that's increased complexity. I mean, obviously, everyone.
Just to add to that, Louise, you'd expect that to be worked out pre-completion, so you wouldn't be expecting someone to take a retention, for argument's sake, to then argue about that beyond completion.
Yeah, it can be worked out pre-completion. Yes, the formulas. I don't know if you've seen them. They're pretty frightening. They're pretty comprehensive. They can be worked out. I'm more in favour of doing that. Otherwise, you are going to have terrible wrangles later on. I mean, I don't know when some of these abatements are even going to be taken on. It'll be later on, and if not dealt with, the buyer's going to have a bit of a nasty shock later on. So yeah, it's probably never. It's never nice to bring this up. Everybody, doesn't want to deal with these complicated formulas, but it probably is better to deal with it then, and it's fair. Yeah. The other thing, obviously, not so much now. I suppose at the beginning after lockdown, there was a bit of obsession with footfall coming back to the practice. Have those, particularly private practices, have those fees still come in every month. That was quite a big thing. I saw some stuff on capitation schemes. Obviously, that kept people going during the lockdown. The capitation money kept coming in. I have begun to see a few issues with that. I think some patients have started to cancel now. They didn't say they were entitled to 3 visits per year, whatever, and they didn't get that. I've seen some people cancel, or some people, some of the patients have paid, but they're still owed 2-3 visits. And buyers obviously don't want to be left with patients who want more visits, but yet the sellers have the money for it. So that's another issue we've got to look at in due diligence, which just causes more complexity, I suppose.
Is that interest, Baldit, do you have a plan in the practice that you've got at the moment?
Yes, we do. Yeah, we've got DEM plan over most sites, and one of them is still on practice plan.
So how did you manage that sort of like the patient expectations in terms of the fact that obviously because the practice was closed for sort of 3 and a bit months in the end, have you made patients, have you had to extend opening hours to get everyone in, or how have you kind of managed that to get them in so you don't get a heavy cancellation rate, or have you indeed not noticed that there is a heavy cancellation rate?
During the time we were still seeing patients, talking to them and doing the Zoom calls and telephone triage. So we didn't have a lot fall off for starters, because I think a lot of people who was in pain were still dispensed antibiotics and still having a telephone chat with somebody. So that helped. And when we started back up again, we was looking at increasing our practice and expanding it anyhow. So we had another dentist employed over 3 of the practices that we was expanding, which was our plan anyhow. So that really helped getting through the list. And also, as I mentioned earlier, because NHS practices still wasn't seeing a lot of people and was still sticking to the 1 hour fallow time because they wasn't investing in purifying systems and things like that. We had a lot of them patients shift over to us too.
So you actually saw a slight increase in plan numbers then overall, or?
Yes, we did. Yeah, a vast increase actually. I think a lot of people wasn't overly happy with the NHS practice that they was at with the service they was getting during the lockdown. I think a lot of NHS practice owners kind of thought, I'm getting paid anyway, so why do I need to extend this, or shorten my fallow time, or extend hours, or get more people in? And a lot of them patients who wasn't happy with it have shifted over to private practices in what I've seen.
And obviously that is a knock-on effect and a consequence of the 60% sort of target, because obviously access is significantly down for patients. I mean, do you think that will have a reverse effect as of September, where they announced that there's 100% can now you can start opening your door again to patients, that that could have a negative impact, or or you're not too concerned about that sense?
I'm not, to be honest. I do think that once imagine somebody's going to a practice for the last 10 years and they haven't seen anything else and don't know anything else, that now they're kind of forced to see something else. And I think in a lot of cases where people have been let down by their current practice, and there's this new practice, which may be private and more expensive, but it's someone who's seen them through these times. And I don't think too many, obviously some of them will, especially people who don't pay for their treatments probably will switch back, but I don't think a vast majority will.
Fine, okay, and I suppose from your point of view as an ongoing sort of acquirer, are you concerned about further lockdowns? What's going to happen in the future? Are you fairly?
My personal thought on it is I don't think they would lock down dental practices again. I think the first time around it happened, we was not equipped to deal with these situations. And I think the kind of measures that got into place now, I think would protect patients and staff against any new variants that would come out. And I think while we're open, it also eases a lot of pressure off the NHS and A&E departments and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So,
no, I'm inclined to agree, to be honest. Okay, so on that basis, question for you again, Louise, really is: Are you finding buyers, forcing clauses, provisions for lockdowns? Is that something that whether it's long, silly retentions or and even if that was possible, can you even protect against that? It's so subjective, surely.
Yeah, the main thing, the clauses we're seeing in SPAs are in relation to deferred consideration. Obviously, sellers are, so that by that I mean, so sellers are owed an extra sum of money if the practice achieves a certain turnover. So obviously, sellers are a little bit worried that after they've sold in the earn-out period, the practice is closed, which obviously means the turnover will not be met. And therefore they won't get their earn-out. At first, immediately following the lockdown, I saw a lot more flexibility, really. A lot of buyers were prepared to negotiate, like say a practice was going to be closed for 3 months in a lockdown, to freeze that period of earn-out. So that could restart again as soon as the practice opened. So the sellers did not lose out on their earn-out. There's a bit of grey areas around that. It's like, once the doors get open, you don't get all the people in straight away. Having said that, I've seen a lot more resistance to those sort of clauses now, whether there's a hardening of attitude to it, or whether buyers now see it as low risk. I think the view is probably dentists won't be locked down again. So I think it might be that. But, even when these things have happened, I have found that actually there's been a lot of coordination between parties, actually. And instead of people playing hard and fast with it all and saying, right, you haven't got your earn-out now, I have found there's been, regardless of anything in the SPA or lack of it, there has been some negotiation between the parties to ensure a fair outcome, which is encouraging. A lot of corporates actually were quite good for that aspect. Yeah.
From a reputational point of view, actually, the market is now built on quite reputable groups. And I'm not saying at all that it wasn't.
Yeah.
At least the perception was that was the case. And I certainly don't hear many horror stories where sellers don't get their earn-out, even before pandemic. And and even as arguably a good excuse to try and negotiate that, as you quite rightly said, is that in fact there's provisions in place to extend it and to still allow them to earn that, to get that earn-out, which I think goes to show how the market's changed significantly in the last decade, to be honest. The appetite is there. It's all about reputation. And arguably I can't say the same for first time, for smaller buyers that maybe the first time buyers, but arguably they're not in the, they're not offering the same sort of earn-out. So it's not really. Yeah. I am finding, maybe we're finding this where first time buyers are looking for larger retentions.
Yeah. But going back to that, it's all about a lot of the corporates now. It's more about relationships, isn't it, with the sellers going forward as well. And they do put a lot of focus on that. because if they're tied in for 3 years and they get screwed over in the first year, that's not harmonious for the working relationship for years 2 and 3. Let's be honest, everybody's aim really is to maximize that turnover, and then everyone wins, don't they? The corporate wins, or the buyer wins, and also the seller wins. So yeah, I would hope it's more harmonious for everyone.
Fine. Okay. So Luke, a question to you then, in terms of that, going on the finance point of view, then, for buyers, is, how is that market about? Because from what I understand is the banks still quite keen to lend. Perhaps not all of the buyers that were in the market pre-pandemic are being as competitive, but it still seems that it's very much green light.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back on the fair consideration point, what we have negotiated with a few groups subsequently is that if there is a lockdown, which I think most of us agree that dental practices probably won't be closed again, but if dental practices are closed or they're restricted in terms of the treatments that they can do, that for every month of that being in place, the deferred consideration will be paused, and then that will be tagged on to the end, which is an outcome that I think is probably fair for both parties. But to go back to your question about money, is that what you are seeing is a number of banks, who are particularly active in the sector. Whilst there are, of course, a number of names, I think it's probably fair to say that there's probably about 5 or 6 that really are kind of pushing the envelope, so to speak, at the moment, that we're seeing, commonly. And then, they are offering, really quite cheap money. When you consider where base rate is at the moment, if you've got a bank who's, offering you a deal, even on a fixed rate basis, where you pay a small premium to fix it for a period of time for like 5 years, we're still talking most rates coming in sub 3%. It's only really, the trickier deals where you're seeing sort of rates sort of, probably somewhere between sort of 3.5 and, maybe just under 4. But it's really rare to see a dental loan north of 4% now. And this is a particularly small loan, in which case, obviously, you've got to bear in mind the banks have service costs. So if you're borrowing, say, 120 grand, then it's probably fairly common to see that it's a bit higher to deal with those service costs. But aside from that, we've got cheap money. And of course, where you've got cheap money, you've got lots of people looking to invest in the sector, and also accessible money as well. So for argument's sake, you've got banks who will lend money on as little as sort of like a 5% contribution sometimes if there's other security in the background. And what we've got one bank doing at the moment, which is quite interesting, is using the deferred consideration and seeing it as a contribution towards the deposit. So for argument's sake, if you're looking to get £1 million and you agree with the vendor that you are only going to pay £800,000 of it on completion, that £200,000, you've got to demonstrate you're going to find it from somewhere when it's due, so say in 3 years' time. But then when you go to the bank, they may lend you the entire £800,000 initial consideration on the basis of the fact that technically you're only borrowing 80% of the value of the practice, which is quite an interesting structure, which has allowed some people to buy practices which they maybe otherwise wouldn't have been able to.
Yeah, and obviously Baldip as a group by yourself, you're, from what I understand, using the banks, you're not private equity, and obviously they're quite still keen to lend you the money in obviously in various forms. And are you, to look at how you're funding, are you using one bank, several banks, or do you have sort of a war chest of a bank? And
we've previously always used Lloyds. Due to our completion last year, Lloyds wasn't happy to lend without a 12-month gap in between completions. So we're going with Barclays with our new practice that we're purchasing. And they've been really helpful. They've, as Luke said, they are very active and very helpful to get the loan through. So that's both been all approved now for us, luckily.
Sorry, can I come in? Which banks specifically, there's just a question on the forum as well, but which banks specifically kind of, you're mentioning 5, would you care to just kind of mention those or go into a little bit more detail? We've discussed Lloyds and Barclays, any other ones that kind of spring to mind that are quite active?
Yeah, obviously, we probably have to just caveat it a little bit that we're not giving specific financial advice at this point in time. But probably the most active banks we see at the moment are the 3 names you've just mentioned, so sort of the Lloyds, Barclays, and Wesleyan. We do see a fair bit of TSB at the moment. And interestingly, we've just kind of seen the return of Santander on a couple of deals as well. So they're going to be quite interesting to watch at the moment. And we do see the odd NatWest deal, but it tends to be the kind of the smaller kind of lens that I was just kind of talking about, a little bit of Clydesdale. But I haven't seen Metro Bank for quite some time now.
And are you seeing numbers around 2%, or around, what kind of numbers are you looking at?
It depends on the size of the lens. So quite often, if you're looking at kind of low twos, it tends to be the bigger lens, where you've got that it makes sense for a bank to kind of lend it at that kind of level. Sometimes the bigger lens that you get that are nearer to 3.5% are the lens that are trickier to do. So i.e. there isn't as much history maybe in the background, or there's not the same level of contribution going into the deal. Every deal is kind of different, but I think broadly speaking, it's fair to say that most dental lending sits somewhere between sort of 2% and 3.5% overall for various different reasons.
Yeah. Actually, to add to that, there are alternative products on the market other than the high street banks. We are finding some of the challenger banks like Tatum and Shawbrook, Oak North, who we met with recently, where they are offering. They're very selective in terms of who they're prepared to lend to, but depending on how you're geared. I've got a client who owns 15 plus sites in the Midlands who was offered the best part of 20 million fund with Shawbrook, but he's very lowly geared in that sense. He's only 10% debt to equity, so they're quite happy to give him the cash to go and expand. Now that's not the case for everybody, and I think it's safe to say that you get to a point where eventually you use up what's available, and then you kind of have to consolidate or reduce down your debt levels in order to then almost to get to that next step of growth, which I think then does become a bit of a challenge. And I don't know, Mike, if you're finding this with any of your clients at all, perhaps if they've got several sites where eventually they get to a point where they're having to either restructure their finances completely, or get to a point where their sort of debt ratio is at a certain position where they can continue to secure funds.
Yeah, I mean, the problem that we face when you start getting to multiple sites is how do you actually restructure it in a way that the bank's happy with? So if you're with one bank, they tend to want every dental practice to be within what we call if you're trading as a limited company, within a group of companies, which is fine. But then you're going to be breaching audit thresholds quite quickly. And if there's any dental practices or groups of practices that are audit over the audit thresholds, that's quite a time-consuming, challenging, and expensive thing to go through on a yearly basis. So what's sometimes more ideal is to actually split the group up into two smaller groups. But one bank won't allow you to do that. So then you're kind of forced to go to multiple banks in order to sanction these things, because the existing bank doesn't like the fact that it's not going to be within the same group of the new bank. So it's playing the game, and it's speaking to everyone and making sure that everyone's that everyone's doing the best thing for them at the right time.
I think the one note of caution I put there, a group of companies is a slightly different structure, but what you see quite a lot of is where people put the same practice in the same limited company. And actually, whilst that may have its benefits at that point in time, when it comes to reviewing the portfolio, which a lot of practices do, or even sometimes when the group is then sold and then the new purchaser decides they don't want any given practice, disposal becomes a lot trickier, because particularly if there's an NHS contract, because you then sort of, Louise, I know we did one, didn't we, probably about a year and a half or so ago, but where the vendor had to wait sort of a good sort of year, I think, by the time we got all the tax issues sorted and got the NHS on board to split the two companies, and so that it then gave us a saleable asset, which you may not want to write that period of time. I mean, I don't know if you remember that one, Louise, without naming any names, but
I think I do. I think there's one where we had to take a lot of tax advice, wasn't it, before it got removed, wasn't it? And that,
to do a statutory demerger, which probably means more to Mike than
that was it. And I think often sellers come to you and they don't realize how sort of complicated that is, do they? And they think, oh, just remove this and everything's fine. And actually it's a bit more than people think, isn't it? Involving HMRC and all the rest of it. So yeah, I remember that now.
It's very difficult. And in fact, my advice would be to anyone looking to build a group of companies is to split out the assets. If you've got 10 dental practices in one limited company, and God forbid you're subcontracting some of the NHS contracts from your personal name into this limited company, how do you know how much profits one company's making, and therefore how do you sell that one practice to the one buyer? How do you identify if actually one practice is performing as you want it to perform? And at the end, the tax headache of sorting it all out. okay, yeah, you're going to pay more in compliance costs throughout this journey by having multiple companies because there's multiple sets of accounts you need to do. But it's not, if you have one company with 10 practices or 10 companies with one practice in each, you're not a million miles off through the compliance. You set it up as you want to set it up from the outset, because it will pay dividends when you come to sell or restructure or refinance at some point in the future.
Yeah, I'm actually, we had a few 3 or 4 years ago now where we were doing a number of these disposals, and actually in the end, none of them came to fruition because of the disincorporation with the LAT. It was so laborious. In the end, I think it was 18 months, 24 months down the line, we still hadn't really got anywhere. And obviously that was specific to a certain LAT, and we've got one at the moment which actually has still taken 9 months. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. But as you're right, it's just a headache. From a financial point of view, logistic, legals, and I suppose it depends on why you're disposing of that asset. But if you're doing it because it's not profitable and it's not efficient, it comes to a point where you either have to close the doors or hold fire and run it until eventually you can disband it. But yeah, I completely agree. It's certainly better to keep them independent.
You're gearing yourself up for a headache, even if you find that corporate buyer as well, because a corporate doesn't want, a mess of one company or a couple of companies with a big set of dental practices in. They want to be able to they'll restructure that as soon as they get through it anyway. So if your exit plan is to build and then sell to a corporate, make sure you're setting it up in a way that a corporate's going to want to buy you in the first instance.
Yeah. And Bowdip, are you going to tell us now that you've done it all in one company, or are you going to?
No. Luckily, I have the same advice from my accountant, so no, I haven't. I've kept everything separate too.
Yeah. Good. I mean, and obviously on the topic of companies, there is obviously some tapered relief that's sort of due to come in over the next few years. Are we anticipating that to have an impact on the market? Because I suppose ultimately the HMRC or government's goal is to perhaps keep people to continue to invest in their businesses rather than necessarily maybe pay more tax in the end. But obviously they try and discourage that by increasing the tax and the reliefs. I mean, do we find, I suppose, 2 points from your point of view, Mike, are you advising your clients differently now in anticipation of that? Or is it one of those where you sort of have to just accept that it is a tax, you're going to have to pay it?
I mean, you've still got a choice. You can still be a sole trader or a partnership if you're the GDC registered individual. About it, you couldn't, because I assume you're not GDC. Of course, your wife could be a sole trader herself. So we always have that conversation with the client, and there's always the same questions we ask. It doesn't matter, because just to fill people in, corporation tax is going from 19% where it is now to potentially 25% in 2023 and onwards. And I say potentially because there's this thing called the small profits margin, where if you're a small company, you could still pay 19%. Realistically, if you're a dental practice, single owner operated, you're going to pay somewhere between 19 and 25% if you're a company.
And there was me thinking you were being cynical, and we're going with a slightly political answer that we may have overstated what corporation tax is going to go to in favour of, we get the headlines that they're going to bring it back down to near like 23%. But that wasn't where you were going with that.
Well, no. And if you're a big corporate, it's going to be 25%. Absolutely. If you've got multiple companies, you're going to be at 25%. The rules, they're pretty clever with the rules, and what they've done. And this was around in 2011 as well. So any long-standing dentists may have already had this conversation. They have these things called associated companies. So if you control 2 companies, and control would be over 50%, and if it's husband and wife, then you have control anyway, then these thresholds that you've got, so 250k is the upper threshold, that's 25% tax. 50k and below is 19% tax, and anywhere between is between 19 and 25%. If you've got 2 companies, you half those thresholds, so you're now at 125k and 25k. If you've got 3 companies or 4 companies, you'll quarter those thresholds. And you can see quite quickly at 75k, if you've got 4 dental practices, they should be performing more than 75k. Associate-led side of them, the size of them depends, but you're automatically going to be at 25% corporation tax. So it's an easier conversation to have for a single-handed dentist. Still the same questions, but yeah, someone with multiple sites should gear themselves up for a 6% increase to corporation tax. Not a lot you can do about it. If you're a multiple site owner, owner operated mini group, you're not going to revert back to a sole trade status. You're going to keep it in a limited company, and you just need to factor in that additional corporation tax.
So on the basis of that, then, if as you say, if you're already a limited company, it is, I suppose, to a certain degree, yes, it's things you can sort of do, but it is what it is to a certain degree. If you fall, depending on what threshold you fall in, and I suppose the gap between operating as a sole trader and as a company has closed quite a lot over the last sort of decade. And are you finding now that actually, unless there's for a very particular structure, that is incorporation still worthwhile? It depends. Yeah.
If you're looking at multiple sites, then yes. If you're looking at 1 or 2 or 3 sites, then you need to have a conversation, because the questions we ask: what does your spouse do? Are they a lower earner? Do you need all the cash? What are your future plans? Do you want to buy more business assets, more property, more dental practices? Do you want to use some of the attractive tax reliefs that are available to limited companies? So those that have limited companies, or know of people that do, probably or may know people that are now driving their fancy Porsche, their electric Porsche, or their electric Tesla, or another electric vehicle, because you get excellent write-offs on electric vehicles at this moment in time. So there's ways to manipulate the taxes in limited companies a bit more, because you can plan your dividends. You can look at having some family members that are shareholders, your spouse that's a shareholder. So there's still opportunities to be had. If you're an associate, the attractiveness as a limited company is slightly less, because don't forget, the real reason that limited companies came into existence is to limit liability. And if you are a limited company and you've got your house and your car and your savings outside the company, so long as you trade legally, that's protected. Yeah, and the company can fail, and they can't come after all of your personal cash, and that's a really nice benefit to have if you're looking at multiple sites.
Yeah. So as a result, and as you quite rightly said, the legal benefits, I suppose, the limited liability is a huge plus point. But I think from a selling point of view, Louise, the buying or the selling of a company is far more involved than a sole trader.
Yeah, it's far more involved, because when you buy a company, you are taking on the liabilities of that company, all the historic liabilities that they potentially have had, including, of course, tax. So it's opposed to an asset purchase, you're just cherry picking the good bits. You're basically taking goodwill stock, and you won't really have liabilities coming along with that unless there's an NHS contract. So yeah, buying a company is a lot more complicated. There's much more due diligence. There'll be a lot more financial due diligence you have to do to ascertain just what you're buying. There will be a more complicated mechanism on completion. The purchase price may be, say, £1 million, but a buyer's not going to pay £1 million if there's like a 200k overdraft. So there will be completion accounts drawn up on completion, and then that will reconcile the price later on. And there's even more considerations if that company's cash rich, and obviously the seller doesn't want to remove that money by dividend. There may well be extraction methods that are negotiated into the SPA to enable the excess cash to be returned as a payment on account of net asset value. So yeah, it's much more complicated. All doable. Obviously, there's many more practices these days coming through share sales. So yeah, there's much more of that. With COVID, all the rest of it, we do have to be a bit more careful. If that company has taken out any sort of grant or anything like that, we need to see if there's any how and when that's going to be paid back. If that's not sorted out, that's going to be the buyer's responsibility, because they literally take over lock, stock and barrel of everything in that company.
Okay, so you touched on obviously the NAV, sort of net asset value, and the adjustments necessary there. So I suppose a twofold question really to maybe Luke and Mike is, how does that affect a buyer's point of view? If a company's got £500,000 sat in an account, are they going to have to find another £500,000 in order to buy the practice? And then back to Mike, I suppose, on this are there mechanisms in place to allow you to extract that more tax effectively?
Fine. So yeah, the short answer is do you have to find another £500,000? No, is all just a paper chasing exercise. It is fairly accepted principle though that because you're benefiting from a lower tax rate by keeping that £500,000 in the limited company and your buyer taking it inferior on paper, then you would pay the additional stamp duty that arises as a result of selling that £500,000, which is 0.5%. So that's fairly acceptable principle. So no, the short answer is with regard to positive NAVs, is it doesn't really make any difference. If anything, I'm sure Mike will say it's probably more tax advantageous for a vendor to leave as much money in the company as possible at this point in time, but it doesn't really affect a buyer as long as their accountant knows what they're doing.
Yeah. So cash. I mean, you've got to be careful that the company is still classed as trading, and holding cash is an investment. It's pretty unlikely that a dental practice would be classed as an investment company. It would have to have a lot of cash in it. So there is an overriding maximum amount of cash that one company should hold and you should sell, because that could affect the business asset disposal relief for the seller, the old entrepreneurs relief for the seller. They wouldn't be entitled to it if it wasn't a trading company. So it's worth checking that. Essentially, these, because dental practices can only be limited companies since 2006. So it's a relatively new thing to buy a dental practice that is a company. With practices that have incorporated at some point after 2006 before sale, they're not going to have a holding company. Okay, a lot of group companies will have a holding company and then have trading subsidiaries. And if that's the case, actually it's tax-free and tax efficient for the subsidiary just to move that cash up to the holding company. So we wouldn't have the scenario that we're talking about here. But if the shareholder owns the shares in the trading company because they've incorporated it or they've bought it without a bank loan at some point previously, then yeah, you could have a lot of cash in there, and that cash could be entitled to 10% entrepreneurs relief or business asset disposal relief, rather than taking it as a dividend historically, which you'd pay 32.5% as a higher rate, potentially 38.1% as an additional rate taxpayer. So definitely some tax savings to be had if you're looking to sell your practice and your company in the next kind of 3 to 5 years. Some planning opportunities there.
And are you finding this issue come up more and more? Obviously, you deal with a broad range of clients where they are sat on large amounts of cash, at the point of sale, or not as common.
It depends on the. If we look at dental practices, it depends on the practice and it depends on the dentist. I think a lot of dentists are still guilty of not maximising some other reliefs. So if you're talking about your pensions, I mean, some dentists just don't believe in pensions. Their pension is their practice. But there's certainly some real good tax reliefs to be had there, and that's a good way of getting rid of a lot of cash in your company. If you can use yours and your spouse's pension contributions for the 3, 5, 10 years up to sale, you could be getting rid of 80 grand worth of cash a year, depending if you've got an NHS pension. But yeah, I'd say it's pretty common. I mean, generally the life cycle as a principal, you become extremely cash poor in the early days of buying a practice, and then if you want to reinvest, you don't get too much more cash as a kind of personal cash, and then towards the end of your career, you've taken as much cash as you need, paid off the mortgage, and then anything left you leave in your company because you don't want to pay the tax. You paid enough tax in your lifetime, so you bulk it in there and you sell it. I mean, most dentists I think would sell with more cash in the company than less cash in the company.
Okay. You mentioned then briefly about sort of other allowances that perhaps aren't maximised from a tax point of view, and obviously we had the budget in sort of March 2021 this year, and are you finding that practice still aren't maximising any changes since March 2021, or were there many to really maximise in that respect?
Well, there was the super deduction which came in. So if you're a limited company, again, only for limited companies, not for sole traders or partnerships, the super deduction means that any CapEx, any capital expenditures, so any equipment purchases, refurbishments, that kind of stuff, excluding building work, you'll get 130% deduction for. Quite clever, because actually if you look at the maths, that equates to almost 25% corporation tax relief on it. If you do the maths, you get to about 24.8%. And of course, as we talked about, corporation tax is going up to 25% in a couple of years. at the same time when the super deduction gets removed. So the ploy there is to get businesses to reinvest, get their tax relief now, but actually they'll claw that tax back in the future once this business is better, earning more cash, therefore paying a higher rate of corporation tax. The pension thresholds changed. That was 2020. Was it this tax year? Can't remember. So anyone that did have a tapered pension allowance may not have a tapered pension allowance now. So dentists that were sole traders or taking a lot of cash out of their limited company may have had an issue where you can have £40,000 pension allowance, but that gets abated down to 10k. Now it's getting abated down to 4k, but those thresholds have gone up by £90,000. Long story short, if you don't earn have adjusted income of over £310,000, then you probably can start look at maximising or increasing pension contributions again. Be very careful with NHS pensions because it's a defined benefit scheme, not a defined contribution scheme, which means you need to look at the growth of the pension, not the contributions. But speak to your accountant; they'll be able to let you know what you can put in there, and that can save you a lot of tax. And get it into your pension, into your SIP, and then you can invest it in what you want. Electric vehicles we talked about, and then the other thing was if anyone made a loss in 2020 due to COVID, again for dentists, I mean a new principle maybe, but there's not many practices. I have had one that did make a small loss thinking about it. I think we're talking 10 grand. Long story short, he's allowed to expense his amortization of goodwill. So he did make a tax loss. You can now carry that back up to 3 years. It was previously 1 year. So if you made a loss, you can then actually carry that back and get some cash back from HMRC if you made profits in the previous 3 years. Other than that, there wasn't a lot to report. I think the biggest thing is watch the space and watch the next budget, because they attacked corporation tax in the last budget. The Tories did say they weren't going to increase VAT, income tax and capital gains tax, I think 3 years ago, and they promised a 3-year window. So we're now past that 3-year window. So it wouldn't surprise me. Look, COVID, I think, has cost the government it will cost them over £5 billion. The revenues from taxes alone is £550 billion a year. Corporation tax increases aren't going to recoup much. Yes, there's this new global tax coming in that you may have read about for the likes of Amazon and Google and stuff. That's going to recoup 10, 15 billion. I don't know. The figures aren't out yet. It's still a big hole. It wouldn't expect me if income tax, capital gains tax was attacked at the next one. Perhaps not capital gains tax, but income tax. Income tax generates 35% of UK revenues. So a small increase in income tax could make a big difference in the government's coffers.
And on the point of obviously CGT, which is quite valid, is that we see it time and time again, and we've seen it over the last sort of 4 or 5 years where there's talks of it, and obviously they have reduced it over the last sort of 5 to 10 years as well, to the point now where there's still a nice relief, because obviously even if you look at the average sale value, still sort of £1 million is actually most sort of do fall under that to a certain degree. So there are still some benefits to be had there. But I suppose, the argument is whether we will see again another wave of panic sales leading to the end of the year as a result of it. And Luke, again, we see this year on year, don't we? I'm sure Louise.
I mean, just to clarify, you're talking about reductions in business asset disposal relief thresholds and entrepreneurs relief, as opposed to reductions in the CGT tax rate, which has obviously stayed largely the same. But BADR relief, we used to be unlimited. Then it went to 10 million quid. Then I think it went to 5 million quid to 2 million quid, down to $1 million. And every year we kind of, have this. I've got to sell my practice. I've got to be sold by, before the budget, because if not, I might be paying. Obviously the horror stories last time was I'm going to be paying the income tax rate on the sale of my practice instead of 10% tax. we haven't got a crystal ball. I can't sit here on this webinar and say it definitely won't happen. But what I suppose I could sit here and philosophically say is that I've been doing this for 14 years and I've heard been through the same process every 14 years of everyone needing to be exchanged and sold by a given period of time. Now, clearly a lot of people in dental did get burned by the big reduction from 5 million to 2 million, because that's, if you like, the pivot point for a lot of practices that we act on. So that, especially when you build in the cash element on some of the limited company sales and some of the bigger practices, they did end up getting clobbered, with a higher rate of CGT because we weren't quite there. So there has been a few people burned as a result of that change in threshold. We have, we take a little bit of feedback from some of, some sort of big accounting firms, and they're making, murmurs that it probably won't happen in the autumn statement. That's not to say that it won't happen in the spring budget. But equally, there is also the political argument to say that we're currently at £1 million. That's not really a great deal of relief when you consider it's 20% tax instead of 10% tax. And arguably what the government need to do is encourage entrepreneurialism. And that's one of the things that does it. So the counter argument to the fact that, well, if they've reduced it so much over the years that maybe it'll go all together, I think is that in some way, shape or form, they need to demonstrate that they are, especially a conservative government, that they are a government that's encouraging entrepreneurialism, and to remove that particular relief, potentially you could argue doesn't encourage that.
Yeah, there's two things with CGT that ring true, and one is, entrepreneurs employ people, and trust me, unemployment costs a lot more than some CGT tax paying on entrepreneurs selling their business. Two, CGT generates 2% of UK's tax revenues. Okay, it's not big fish. It generates about £11 billion a year. And we get in £556 billion of revenue. So it will annoy a lot of people. It will hinder entrepreneurialism, which hinders employment. And it's not going to actually make a big impact in that huge deficit they've got due to COVID. So there is no crystal ball. But I think the change from entrepreneurs relief to business asset disposal relief was probably enough.
Fine. Okay. Brilliant. Okay. So maybe to touch on a few other sort of market sort of questions. To Luke, in terms of the market, obviously we discussed earlier, the market is still relatively strong, and as obviously we can see that from sort of what Baldip's saying as well in terms of the appetite for practices. Overall, how are you finding the market from a broker's point of view at the moment?
As with anything, there's always fits and starts, and we've discussed that over the last sort of 3 to 4 weeks there has been a bit of a slowdown, I think, in terms of new instructions coming to market. And what is difficult is normally I could predict a seasonality to it, so it always goes a bit quiet in August, it always goes a bit quiet just before Christmas, and it always goes a bit quiet again just before the end of the UDA year, because you get lots of people who want to focus and get the new sets of accounts. So we have 3 periods, if you like, where it goes a bit quieter throughout the year. Now, this year we didn't have the quiet period before the UDA year for probably fairly obvious reasons, but it has gone quieter earlier this year. Now, the sanity in me likes to say that the reason that's happened is because the way traveling has changed, and obviously dentists tend to be people who tend to holiday a number of times a year. So what we've got is, as the travel corridors have opened, we've seen, and certainly anecdotally I can talk from a lot of clients who are going away now, and that's probably one of the reasons why we've seen a slowdown in new instructions. But I suspect that we will see a much busier market again come the middle of September. I think that's when you'll tend to find that when we get sort of 2 or 3 weeks after the end of the school holidays, because again, dentists don't, or particularly the people we act for send their practice, tend to have children off hand by that point, so they do tend to holiday outside the main school holidays. I think we'll see a bigger market there. In terms of what is selling, we see private practices, particularly sort of mid-sized to big-sized private practices, are exceptionally popular, and big NHS practices, particularly in the areas I mentioned at the outset of the webinar, are exceptionally popular. Mixed practices do very well on the marketplace at the moment because people like the security of either the NHS or the plan, but also recognise that actually fee per item gives you a lot more control over your profit, because you've got a lot more control over your income and what you charge for those kind of things. What probably struggles to sell is the guys who were the single-handed private practice, where if we have really struggled with this kind of SOP and how that's kind of maintained, and kind of that kind of, if you like, market where there isn't a lot of potential in a practice where it's already incredibly well capitalized, and you're not going to see a great deal of growth in a particular opportunity. And then, as we discussed, geographically, there's some challenges as well in some areas of the UK. But most practices, I would say 85% of what we take to market sells pretty quickly in the main.
Fine. Okay. So we have had a couple of questions sort of come in, and so we'll try and maybe go around a few of these and see. Go from there. One of them is to you, Luke. First is the question is they've shortlisted 2 practices from a buyer by the sounds of it, a mixed practice and a private referral practice. And what they're interested in is what are the normal sort of multiples they should be looking at within and outside London for the 2 types of practice that they're looking at. Yeah,
I mean, to be honest, I don't think we can really give multiples per se, because there's lots of factors that impact a multiple, and also I'm a little bit at odds not to give multiples, because I think a lot of people got really hung up on what multiple of EBITDA their practice may sell for, and what you've got to remember is that EBITDA isn't what's on your accounts, because you've probably got a load of costs running through those accounts, to mitigate your tax bill, because that's why most people have their accounts prepared. Equally, you probably haven't costed in maybe a full associate fee for what you may be doing clinically in the practice, or indeed a rent if you own the building. So if we have conversations with people that ring up and say, I've read in documents somewhere that practices are selling for 7 times EBITDA, thus my practice is worth £4.5 million, and then when we actually get to the crux of it, it's not worth anywhere near £4.5 million. And equally, you then get people who get a really low net profit because they've got amortization and depreciation running through their accounts, who undervalue their practice for because they're using standard multiples. It is all about what, and different people will have a subjective view on EBITDA as well, is ultimately with a practice, to answer the question in terms of mixed or private referral practice, I would expect that the private referral practice would be valued at a lower multiple, because you would perceive that there is a much higher risk in that opportunity, particularly if the referral base is quite modest in terms of, there's a small number of referrals. But then arguably, there are some very successful private referral practices, and we do sell a number of them to groups if the vendor is locking in for a period of time. Mixed NHS practice, again, depends on the profitability. Again, going back to what I just said a minute ago, if that practice is heavily weighted in terms of NHS contract, and there's not a lot of growth in that particular opportunity, you've got to consider, will the sustainability of the profit maybe long term. So we can't really, without knowing information, I think, directly answer that question, apart from kind of talking around the edges, which is probably what I've done for the last 2.5 minutes.
Sure, it'd be sufficient. A question to you about it is, obviously, your strategy is very much to buy existing sites. One of the question is, what would your advice be to somebody who might be considering setting up a squat versus buying a practice? And I'm not sure if you've set up any squats in the 5 that you've got, but I don't know from your point of view whether you could maybe analyze the risk from your perspective and why you choose to acquire rather than maybe set up squats.
I've had a good think about this. Personally, I think setting up a squat is very expensive, very risky, especially if you're a owner-occupier dentist. You're then giving up your current monthly wage to go into your squat, where you may or may not have anybody coming across for a period of time. I think there probably is some sites out there where there is a need for one. I don't think I've personally come across any myself. I think by the time you've set up and you've got your loan on your chairs or cabinetry, and you've got a rent to pay and a receptionist and a nurse, I think you're probably forking out very close to £100,000 a year before taking anything in at all. So I think it's too risky for me personally.
I suppose that then from your point of view as well, the level of working capital as well that's required for that is that it becomes quite a big challenge compared to grossing up and earning income from day one.
Yes, definitely. But I mean, when you got a practice that you're buying that's existing, you've got an existing patient base there, existing staff members, everything's kind of set up for you to go in and start earning money or making money from day one, which is great, especially with the low interest rates that the banks give to the dental market. Yeah.
And Mike, do you find many of your clients anchor into set up squats, or you find that it's not heavily advised, in particularly in the current climate?
I think COVID has pushed a few associates to look more seriously at it. So I think personally at the moment I'm acting for around 20 purchases or sales, and of that I think 4 or 5 of them are squat practice setups. They're young entrepreneurial dentists in the main that don't want to pay for the goodwill of a practice because their perception is that goodwill is valued too high in the dental world at the moment. Banks won't lend, or they generally won't lend. So you're looking at asset finance, it's more expensive. You're going to need to completely overestimate the working capital you need to inject. So you're looking at either having some decent savings or, well, ideally some decent savings and ideally Bank of Mum and Dad, or some available funds that you can rely on as and when your savings dry out, because inevitably they probably will. I do have a client whose game is to set up squats, decent squats, 4, 5, 6 surgery squats. Luckily for him, he's in a position where he has the available funds to do so. And actually, once the squat's up and running, generally after 24 months, because of BAD relief, he will then sell, and he can set up a squat, spend 300, 400, 500 grand on it, and sell it for not far off, or just over £1 million. So 500 grand in a couple of years is a decent return. It's all about location, and it's all about your mentality. That the guy I'm talking about here, he's an ex-practicing dentist, so he doesn't do any dentistry. His business is identifying locations, setting up squats, and selling them on.
Okay, well, okay, good. So another question is surrounding, and maybe Louise may be able to answer this, is surrounding sort of bank paperwork with companies since sort of COVID. How the banks finding that, has that got a little bit more laborious, slower? Are we finding that's drastically changed, or?
To be honest, no, I haven't. Obviously, in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown, as you know, a lot of banks wouldn't just pick up. They wanted to see 3, 4, 5, 6 months post-COVID trade before they do anything. But in terms of their requirements, no, I can't see anything's changed. I think some of that's because they don't really understand a lot of what's going on. For example, a condition is always, is there any underperformance in NHS contracts? They won't understand the abatement issue at all. So that will just be encompassed in that one condition that was always there before. Was there underperformance? And if there is, you need to make sure there's a reconciliation mechanism on completion. But I can't say there's been anything specific on it at all, to be honest. No.
Well, actually, one of the questions that has been asked is around an underperforming NHS contract. Now, that's obviously quite a difficult question at the moment, because most contracts have been underperforming probably for the last sort of 18 months. Now, arguably, there's parameters within that as to where your underperformance is. Yeah. But that surely opens up a question as well as to how enforceable is it if you're only hitting 50%, but you should be hitting 60%, because we're still going through what we're going through as an industry. But one of the questions is, how risky are they? How risky are underperforming NHS practices at the moment? How likely is it that your contract could be taken off you or reduced?
I think, we are in a bit of a state of flux with the NHS contract, so I kind of wouldn't like really to comment there as to what isn't going to happen, because I think we're not sure. Historically, if I go back to position there, with underperformance, it depends when you get breach notices. The GDS contracts normally say, I think it's 2 breach notices, and then we can reduce or terminate. I would say it's quite interesting, really. That's all written down, but actually, from my experience, I've seen practices repeatedly underperform and get breach notices. I have actually rarely seen a contract just removed without a lot of warnings before it happened. You don't just suddenly see someone's performed 94%, next year, sorry, you're out. You don't tend to see that.
Well, I agree. Doing this for the last sort of 10 plus years is actually, we very rarely see contracts that have underperformed year on year. They latterly then to their contracts completely terminated. Is, if anything, I have seen cases where they're rebased, or there's an agreement.
Yeah.
We're both from 28,000, 24,000 UDAs, but often that's quite a long process. It's not something that happens overnight.
And that's normally a negotiation, isn't it? Normally, kind of the area team, put the frighteners on, so to speak, and then the agreement is that if you're hitting 23,900 UDAs, then that becomes your new contract, and that's one way of securing it. So I would say that the risk is probably the bit that's being underperformed per se, as opposed to the whole NHS contract. In purely practical terms, obviously Louise is right with what she's saying about the 2 breach notices, but I'd say in purely practical terms, it's probably just the bit that's been underperformed.
Yeah, I mean, to get around that, obviously, some buyers are more nervous than others. Some will balk at, if they're trying to buy a practice and there's been 2 breach notices quite recently. That's enough for some buyers not to carry on. Other people have got different views. Obviously, contractually, you can put things in. If you're really worried about it, you can put a big retention in for the next couple of years and say, if there's a breach notice in the next 2 years or whatever, and it's, we can get some of this money back. That works for a lot of people. So we do see that, but it's down to people's attitudes to risk, really, and how much that contract is underperformed and the reasons why it's been underperformed, really.
Yeah, I think the reasons why is quite pertinent, isn't it? Because I think there's a similar pattern, I would probably say, with practices that I see underperforming NHS contracts, particularly children's only contracts. I tend to find very rarely will ever be achieved, and that's largely because the existing owners decided to wind it down, and they don't see that it's got the same return of investment that seeing a private patient would have, and they arguably the red tape and everything around it. And I suppose that comes down to you, Baldip, as well. Is how do you see, if you approach a contract that's underperforming as a buyer, are you concerned, or do you look at it and go, okay, well, why is there an underperformance? And with your experience in running, NHS practices, see that actually that could easily be remedied as long as it's not a market issue, but arguably, is that ever really the case necessarily?
I think it's very important to have a good relationship with the seller and to get to the bottom of what's going on and why it isn't being achieved. Some practices have a lot of patients that will go in for an NHS checkup, but want a private filling, want a private crown. That's not to say that there isn't patients there who are available for the NHS, but they're just not taking up the certain treatments to hit the UDAs. And as a practice owner, you can either sell someone a private crown for £600 or a band 3 treatment for, I don't know what it is now. But yeah, so I think it's very important to speak to the seller and get to the bottom of exactly what's going on. And maybe I've just been lucky, but I've usually found sellers to be quite honest and tell you exactly what's going on. I've never come across a practice seller who tells you one story and then the due diligence, kind of digs out something else.
Fine. Okay, brilliant. I've sort of exhausted most of the questions that had come in from the audience. I mean, there was one where I'm not too sure exactly what you mean, which is, as an industry, what is the return on investment? There's probably a million and one different answers to that, depending on what you're buying and how and arguably, we're in a very different market to what we were. Most practices now are very much about the long-term business model. So
it depends what you pay for it, doesn't it, really? I mean, probably the only way I would answer, which isn't an answer to a different question, which I think might have been the question around about kind of way, is that typically if you're running an associate-led dental practice, we would expect EBITDA to be somewhere between 16 to 23% of revenue. So for every £1 in revenue, we'd expect EBITDA to be somewhere, associate-led, we'd expect it to be somewhere between 16 pence to 23 pence. Again, there are people that are a lot higher than that because they've got very profitable practices. There are some practices in London that are a lot lower than that because of extremely high rents. So it does swing in roundabouts, but generally speaking, that's kind of where it is. And then I think the one other question which we saw is, I think someone might wanted you to put a number on at what point HMRC would deem a company an investment company.
80%, 20%. So that's generally the rule. So if your trade's 80% of your business, then you should be okay.
Fine.
There we go.
Fine. Okay. Well, I think we've probably exhausted most of the questions we had. To be honest, I know we have had somebody else come in. Let's have a look.
Just while you're looking, I was going to ask on CQC, how are we finding CQC at the moment? Because they were quoting one of my clients 6 months to do the registration for a purchase. Has that dropped now?
That's probably got a bit better. We went for a period of time where they basically moved all of their teams to dealing with COVID response, i.e. registering the vaccination hubs and that kind of thing. All of those people appear to have moved back now. So actually we're back finding that the CQC are often ahead of the transaction as opposed to behind it. So I would probably say we're probably at 14 to 15 weeks, probably quite substantially lower than 6 months now. They are, of course, very reticent to actually go out and do a physical inspection. So if it is a new premises they're setting up, you might find it's a bit longer. But if it's just a standard transfer, then you'll find, and most of it can be done over the phone in terms of the interview and the like, then I think you'll find it'll be quite a fair bit quicker.
And your average taking an offer to complete time frame?
It probably is about the 6 month mark. We have got some that, get to 12 and 18 months and that kind of thing. But then we equally have, a fair number that go through in 4 to 5 months now. So we tell people on average to budget for between 6 to 8 months in terms of sort of once they've got an offer agreed. But if we're honest, and Louise will probably back me up on this, the people that slow the transaction down in probably 85% of cases are actually the vendors themselves, because they don't do the due diligence, or they don't answer the questions properly enough, or there's a problem with the property which they've got control over and could have been sorted before it goes on the market. I find it's actually quite rare that the resulting factor in slowing down a purchase is the purchaser.
Yeah, 100%. Sellers can shave off 2 months off a deal time. They honestly can, if they could get their DD pack ready. So as soon as the heads of terms are signed, if their comprehensive DD pack is ready, honestly, you can shave off 2 months, really. But 95% of people do not do that. And myself and Luke have talked about this for years. Yeah. That'd be my top tip.
Which I suppose leads you on to the advice that any NASDAL or specialist accountant or solicitor would give, in that the amount of time you'll save by using someone that actually understands how to buy or sell dental practices will easily beat the 2 months of having a good DD pack, because you shave off all of the toing and froing and communications between non-specialist accountants and solicitors.
Absolutely, and at risk of repeating a conversation that Louise and I had at 5 o'clock this afternoon, is that there are lots of firms in commercial law in particular that are quoting what seemingly are quite competitive fees, because obviously a lot of other work has slowed down as a result of COVID, and they sound like quite exciting fees at the time. So I think the particular transaction we were talking about, the guy was quoted somewhere in the region of about $8,000 to do the transaction, but because it was an estimate as opposed to a fixed fee, and there's nothing wrong with estimates versus fixed fees, because of course what a lawyer doesn't know is how much work's going to be involved in the transaction. But if you're dealing with a dental specialist, they generally know what's going to be involved, so the estimate you can pretty much rely on is going to be pretty accurate. In this particular case, because they were non-dental specialists, and they had underestimated and then did, I think it's probably fair to say to Louise, in this case they did a hell of a lot of work that didn't actually need doing.
Absolutely.
The fee came out at, am I allowed to say what the fee
Yeah.
was, Louisa? $55,000 on a transaction.
Wow.
Yeah, and he was quoted 8. Is that shocking? But I could tell the way it was going, because I don't know, to me they seem to be generating work and really non-stop questions about minutiae. We had employment partners rolled out on the most minor of issues. I think they quoted $3,000 just to look at the associate contract, which is crazy. But yeah.
Fine.
Yeah.
And I can see another question asking what we determine as a mixed practice. Basically, if it's more than 20%, if it's less than 20% private, it will be an NHS practice. If it's less than 20% NHS, it will be a private practice. And if it's anything in between, we will deem it as mixed, which I think is the same criteria NASDAL use.
Yeah, it is correct.
Yeah. And I think he's also asking on that question is probably towards you, Baldip, is what factors do you look for to assess private potential in a practice?
I'd probably look at the NHS patients that are registered at the moment, the percentage of fee paying to non-fee paying, how much the practice is currently offering private treatment, what that 20% is kind of made up from. What are they not offering? Is there any specialist services, Invisalign braces, implants, anything like that? what the potential is in the area, what do other practices offer in the area. That's what I've usually based it on, to see if we could expand the private side.
Fine, okay. And then another question has come in, again, probably to, feel free anyone to chip in on this one. But a practice, somebody's obviously approaching a practice which is completely closed, and they're looking at the risks. What are the risks surrounding buying that practice, and will there be difficulty in transferring the contract? Now, transferring the contract, I'm guessing not the case, because obviously the same sort of route will be applied. But from a risk point of view, I don't know what liabilities can be passed to a non-exempt person who's not high risk to somebody who is low risk. I wouldn't know that.
I think they're referring to the fact that they're at risk from COVID, so they haven't opened the practice.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah. So could that? And obviously they are at risk. So I'm guessing there's no comeback from a later point of view from a new owner taking over. I'm guessing that's not the case.
But I think the short answer to that question is it depends how long the practice has been closed as to what goodwill's left. The argument is if the practice has been closed for 6 months, where have the patients been going, from a private goodwill perspective? And that's something that is open to each individual to assess their own judgment on it, really. I guess I don't really know how you qualify without opening the practice, reopening the practice and seeing who comes back. With regard to NHS, it's probably more for Louise. If you've had someone who is deemed to be at risk of COVID and has been shielding at the various different points in time and thus hasn't been able to go to work, can the NHS breach their contract for failure to perform if they've been technically a shielder?
Yeah, that would just be a direct conversation with the local area team. And I tend to find with issues like that, the local area team are usually quite understanding of the situation. But yeah, it would be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, to be honest. I haven't had it myself, but that's what would happen.
And then one final point, which isn't really a question, more of just a statement, but Landlord and Tenant Act.
It does relate to a question that I think got moved into answered. It was how risky is it to buy an NHS practice outside the Landlord and Tenant Act?
Okay, yeah, so you're right, I didn't see that. Well, there you go. Suppose it's one for you, Louise.
Oh God. Okay. So first of all, I'm not a commercial property lawyer. I'm corporate. Outside. So this must be caveated because I'm not a property lawyer. As I understand it, outside Landlord and Tenant Act, you don't have an automatic right to renew that lease. I know a lot of banks get very nervous about that, even though, for example, it could be a 25-year lease and their loan is paid within 15 years. I know, yes, that is quite a big red flag for a lot of lenders. They don't like that. And equally, then that makes a buyer quite nervous. Obviously, if people buying with cash or whatever, they can take more of a view. But even if something is in the Landlord and Tenant Act, doesn't mean you can't be booted out at the end of a lease. As I understand it, if there's a certain number of conditions, which means even if you're in the Landlord and Tenant Act, you can still be booted out. One of them, for example, if the landlord plans to redevelop or something like that. But yeah, it's fair to say not being in the Landlord and Tenant Act does seem to be risky.
I suppose you've got to caveat the risk, haven't you? I suppose if for argument's sake, the guy, the landlord is, an ex-dentist who's 75, and the chances of reoccupation, which, are probably relatively low.
Yeah.
But then you could maybe even caveat the risk by saying, well, actually, if I'm not going to get that, then maybe I want the option to buy the property or a preemption agreement that says that you can't sell it to someone else without me buying it first. So the only risk is associated with the guy who's 75 and what he may or may not do with it. So again, it probably depends on the individual scenario, I think is probably the answer that I would give.
Yeah.
Okay, and where we've still got a little bit of time, so maybe a question then surrounding properties is, if you are a buyer looking to buy leasehold, freehold, what options are available to them, I suppose, both from a finance point of view and as to whether they look to buy the property or go into a lease. I mean, I suppose from a bank's point of view, Luke, does that make a huge difference?
In terms of the property, no, it doesn't. I think is the short answer. We can finance leasehold properties just as well as we can finance freehold options. The only thing I would say to that is that if you is as long as the freehold doesn't dwarf the business. So if you've got, for argument's sake, which we do have on occasion, particularly practices where there is a residential property attached or the practice isn't using the whole property, and you've got a property value of say 800,000 and the business worth 200,000, then that does become quite hard to finance, because you've got to finance an £800,000 property loan without any income necessarily attached to it, bar what the business is generating. If the business is only worth 200,000, then one would expect that the business isn't generating a huge amount to support the property loan. So I think it all depends on proportions. But as a general principle, obviously a lot of people do prefer freehold for all the obvious reasons of you're paying off your own mortgage as opposed to not paying off someone else's, and especially where you've got a number of lenders at the moment who will do 100% lending on freehold, is that where buyers can get the freehold, they will more often not always choose to do so, particularly the independent market, but as long as it works within the loan framework.
Failure to buy the property and go to a leasehold, the banks are typically looking for what, a 10-15 year lease?
It goes back to what Louise said. I think it was all about the term of the loan. So if you're borrowing the money over 15 years, then you would expect to see a minimum 15-year lease. You've probably got a bit of flexibility by a year or two if it's an existing landlord. If you're borrowing the money over 10 years, you can probably get away with an 11-year lease.
Fine. Okay.
Well, Luke, thank you very much. What I'm going to do is just mention that there is CPD for this event, and when it's finished, when you log off, it should go to that. You'll get a link with the email that you signed up with to get CPD, and that's subject to a feedback form. So if you can fill that out, just putting some details in, and if you want to hear from our very good speakers today and the panel and some of the other sponsors, just tick, and you can have some further questions that, obviously some of this stuff is very detailed and situation specific. So if you have further questions for Luke or the rest of the panel, I'm sure that they'll be very happy for you to email them and contact them offline here as well. I think we can still hang around for 10 minutes of questions if there are any more. And otherwise, thank you, the panel, for a very lively discussion. I've got one last question, which is in terms of the NHS contract and the potential for transformation, or it's going to potentially reform by April next year. Has there been any hesitation, discussion around that in terms of buying and selling practices?
I would probably say not that we haven't already heard in the last sort of 10 years since they've been talking about reforming the NHS contract. I think, to be honest, people do get a little bit nervous sometimes of really high UDA values and what they may look like after contract reform. And equally, where you've got practices which have got really low patient numbers, so delivering the NHS contract, if we're seeing people on a very short interval ratio. But aside from that, I wouldn't particularly say there's a lot of talk about NHS contract reform anymore, because I think, if I'm being perfectly honest, we've all talked about it so much over the last 10 years, people have almost given up on it happening, even though it does look like it is a bit more likely now. I haven't seen yet the conversations come back.
There is certainly an element of it looking far more likely, given the pandemic speeding everything up towards that, and Wales have moved to this kind of ACORN kind of classification and so on. So it seems likely, but obviously it may stay in a UDA form or some other acronym for contract delivery. So it's just a question of what that looks like, and I guess time will.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we deal with a number of pilot practices, and we've sold a number of pilot practices. In fact, Paul's probably sold a couple more than I have. And I think in the main, a lot of these pilot practices seem to be doing relatively well from a business EBITDA perspective. Of course, the challenge from the government in talking to a few of the pilot practices is they haven't got the same level of access. So there is an argument to say, will we see a repetition of what we saw in 2015 to 16, where you had these PDS practices who, let's face it, probably did pretty well from the ultimate, what ultimately became the NGDS contract and NPDS, but it didn't resemble anything like what they were doing in the pilots. And I think that's probably the bigger concern, is that the pilots look okay from a practice owner's perspective in the main at the moment, apart from a lot of them are hemorrhaging patients if they then have to go back to NGDS. But whether that's what we ultimately end up with is, of course, an entirely different question.
Yeah, well, I think that's a fair question. Is we've got a couple of pilots at the moment, and where if they follow through with how it's currently structured, where there's an element which is capitation versus activity, then arguably that capitation is paid over a 3-year period, which means that patients aren't necessarily having to come through the door for treatment, but they're coming through for checkups, and they remain on a capitation for 3 years, which arguably will increase access over a longer period of time. The downside is as to whether, you know, that does work in the long term if the activity is significantly higher in given regions, which arguably then could reduce access if only 30% of your contract is a UDA element. And what I've seen so far is I've got two opposite views of that. I've got one which was in the northeast, which we sold recently, and he actually reduced his contract down by 200,000 to make it more profitable and for it to work, because the activity level was just so far unachievable compared to what the reduced element was. Whereas I've got one in the southwest where it works perfectly, and I suppose it depends on whether you're at the moment on a blend A or blend B, and how that works. But yeah, you know, from what I can see is they certainly can be operated more effectively in terms of patient numbers. But I think it largely comes down to region. But yeah, I don't actually say it's all speculation at the moment, depending on what they decide to do.
I see someone's thrown a last minute question in about orthodontics, about the specific issues related to ortho. Ortho, of course, has its own contract issues, in the sense of the fact that if you've got a short-term contract, it becomes quite difficult to sell. So by short-term, I mean the guys who've got a contract that's been rolling over, because of course a lot of you have been through a tender exercise that then got abandoned at various different points in the process, and the contracts weren't awarded. And then as we came out of COVID, your contracts were extended for different periods of time. And so you've got, in a lot of cases now, where are we now in July? Some of you have got as little as 9 months running on the contract, some a year and 9 months, and that is quite difficult to sell, because what we have seen in the South Coast, of course, is a number of orthodontic providers moved to newer providers, which means that arguably there is a business risk that someone could pay a lot of money for that business and then actually end up without an NHS contract, and in some cases, if it's exclusively an NHS business, without a business there at all. There are obviously some issues, not necessarily issues, but orthodontics in terms of mechanisms of sale sometimes can be slightly different, because you've got to worry a lot more about work in progress. But that is probably, again, a more specific discussion to a specific case, where, you know, if someone wants to ask me a question directly.
Fine. Well, I think that wraps it up, Lemish, unless you've got anything else to add before we do.
Not particularly. I again just want to thank the whole panel and giving up your time in the evening, and the attendees and the delegates here that have contributed and so on. And yeah, I would strongly encourage the people on this webinar to reach out to these experts. And you've seen it over the last couple of hours, really, that they know what they're talking about, and just go and speak to them. Pick up the phone or email them across and see what they have to say about your situation, be it an associate. So I you know, based in Croydon, we get a lot of people asking me for advice on, you know, setting up practices, squat versus buying a mixed practice and so on. And I say, look, just get good professional advice. And, you know, we've seen that over the last couple of hours. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Excellent. So yeah, we'll leave it for now. And any other questions, James can kind of feed those across if there are any. But otherwise, if you just tick the thing on the feedback form, we can push them across to the group that's there. Excellent. Thank you so much. If there's anything else, let me know. But otherwise, have a great evening, and I'll catch up with you guys next time.
So,
Have a good
Thank
evening.
you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye bye.